The certainty of silence. Eira found comfort in the warmth of the Viscount's arm. The cold of the chapel, and the pain in her knees and hips were bearable as long as he was beside her. Despite the many failed engagements she had endured, she had never longed for a man's attention. She had misjudged the brave warrior kneeling beside her. The woman who won his love and loyalty would truly be fortunate. No matter how much she wished for his respect, he would never see her as anything other than a liar. And why would he trust her? She suspected that Caelan couldn't bear the proximity that forced their bodies to touch. The urge to confess her secret was almost irresistible, but even a whisper would draw all eyes upon them. He would never know the real Eira of Lysarne. She barely recognized herself anymore. That bitter certainty tightened her throat and filled her eyes with silent tears, which glistened in the dim light of the chapel. Time seemed to stop, and with every shared breath, every inadvertent brush, the tension between them grew more intense, as if the closeness itself held secrets that could never be revealed. The weight of temptation. The family rites of Good Friday slowly calmed Caelan's spirit. The incense floated like a scented mist, and the priest's deep chant lulled him into a state of serene contemplation. He responded to the prayers almost without thinking, guided more by tradition than by mind. For a moment, he thought about the future. The French worshipped the same god as the Normans, so perhaps life under a foreign king wouldn't be so terrible. Although King John also shared the same faith, and yet he was a disastrous ruler. His calm was broken when the priest invited them to venerate the cross. Caelan helped Eira to her feet, and the lavender scent of her hair enveloped his senses, evoking images he shouldn't allow. Behind her, as they moved toward the altar, he had to clench his hands to resist the urge to tangle his fingers in the red strands peeking out from beneath her transparent veil. Later he wouldn't remember if he had actually kissed the feet of the crucified Christ, but he would remember his silent prayer. He asked God to deliver him from the temptation that was Eira of Lysarne. Because in that moment, he truly feared that woman had bewitched him. Chapter 25. Resurrection, Sunday, March 28, 1204, Easter. When Caelan entered the great hall, the air buzzed with joy. The tables overflowed with laughter, music, and the scent of freshly served food. Easter had always brought hope to Morven, but this time it seemed like something more, a promise of new life after the darkness of war. The bustle paused just long enough to greet him with applause. Caelan smiled and nodded, pleased to see the orphans of Caer Thalen seated among the servants, eating as if they hadn't tasted bread in centuries. That, more than any victory, felt like the true meaning of resurrection. As he filled his plate, he was surprised to feel gratitude for things he had once taken for granted: the warm bread, the smell of beer, the sound of a house full of life. He decided that day would be a starting point. He took his food and his mug of beer to his place at the main table. Having spoken with the priest after Mass, he was the last to arrive. And then he saw her. Eira. Sitting next to her mother, dressed in a simple yet elegant rust-colored gown. The fabric accentuated the paleness of her skin, and the fire of her hair. No jewelry, no veil, and yet she radiated a serene beauty that made the noise of the hall seem to fade away. Caelan placed his plate, ready to sit, but his mother reminded him with a smile, "It's Easter, son." He smiled, gently reprimanded. "Right. I forgot our customs." He went around the table, greeting his brothers, wishing peace and blessing to each of them. Then he turned to his mother and, as tradition required, kissed her cheeks. "Thank you, Caelan. Don't forget about Eira," she said, her intention barely disguised. He hesitated for a moment. Eira kept her gaze lowered, her face slightly flushed. She seemed to wish he would pass by, but when she lifted her eyes to him, something in her expression stopped him. It wasn't fear. Not entirely. It was desire, mixed with confusion. A pang of jealousy shot through him before he could stop it. Had Aemon greeted her with the same gesture? Or Finn? Ridiculous. But the thought stuck to him like a thorn. He leaned toward her, trying to keep his composure, and brushed his lips against one cheek, then the other. The contact was brief, but enough to make his pulse race. The scent of lavender, the warmth of her skin, her shallow breath, it all etched itself into his memory with an intensity that left him undone. She raised her eyes, catching his gaze. For a moment time seemed to stand still. Caelan barely managed to speak the ritual words, "God bless you this Easter day, Eira." She responded with a whisper that sounded like a confession, "And you as well, Caelan." It was the first time he had heard his name on her lips. And it was as if she spoke it not for him, but for the man who still tried to deny what was already inevitable. Rebirth. Eira had never been a religious woman, though faith had always followed her quietly, even through the darkest days of the siege. The word resurrection had long seemed to her an abstract mystery, a symbol rather than a truth. Until that Easter morning. For the first time, she understood what it meant to come back to life. It was like a plant that, after a long winter, feels the sun warm its sap and begins to bloom again. The smell of freshly baked bread, the smoke of ham, the laughter filling the hall, all of it urged her to breathe once more, to leave behind the shadow of fear, to allow herself to exist without guilt. Yes. She had risen. And then the kiss. The chaste brush of Caelan's lips against her skin was like a spark lit upon the dormant wax of her body. It had been nothing more than a greeting, a polite gesture, yet it awakened in her something deeper, older, the desire to feel. For years, she had resented the broken betrothals, the indifference of a king who had used her as a pawn on his board without thought for her fate. She had never loved any of the men to whom she had been promised. In truth, she had never loved anyone. Until now. Caelan of Morven drew her like iron to a magnet, with that quiet strength that asked no permission. His voice, his presence, the way he looked at her as if he saw more than she meant to show, everything about him disarmed her. The faint brush of his beard, the warmth of his breath, the scent of soap and leather, these were enough to kindle in her a new tenderness, a yearning that both frightened and amazed her. And in Caelan's eyes, in that deep blue that could be sea or ice, she caught a fleeting glimmer of desire. But there was also a wall there, invisible yet impenetrable, raised by loyalty, guilt, or fear. Eira understood then that perhaps she could spark his interest, but never his heart. Chapter 26. Easter. Caelan stared at the empty board before him. The ham, the bread, the porridge, he must have eaten them, yet he couldn't recall taking a single bite. To his right, Eamon was cheerfully flirting with a maid, his laughter mingling with the hum of the hall. Across the table, his father gave him an expectant look, perhaps waiting for an answer to a question Caelan hadn't heard. He mumbled a vague reply, hoping it sounded sensible, though his mind was elsewhere. It was always the same when Eira was near. The others celebrated Easter, resurrection, the promise of a new world. But for Caelan the feast carried a different weight, a kind of private resurrection, fragile and fearful, one he scarcely dared to name. Since Celine's betrayal, he had buried himself in a tomb of silence and mistrust. He had lived among shadows, unable to believe in tenderness without sensing deceit. And now, amid the laughter and the scent of warm bread, something within him stirred, a small painful spark that pushed him to remember the man he had been before the wound. It unsettled him to realize that light came from a woman he still did not fully trust. Eira, with her calm air and her gaze that revealed no more than it chose, had kindled in his chest a hope that sought no permission. A hope that hurt. Caelan gripped the edge of the table, feigning attention as his gaze drifted into the flickering candlelight. There, in the trembling glow of the flame, he thought he saw his own contradiction reflected, the desire to draw near and the fear of falling again. Amid the fog, two hearts found their name. Surrounded by cheerful faces and satisfied bellies, Eira thought she had never been in a place happier than Morven. The hall glowed with the warm light of the candles, the scent of bread and roasted meat, and the music that rose and fell like a gentle wave. The people trusted their lord in Caelan, and that silent faith could be felt in every corner. But for her, among all the scents of the feast, there was only one she could not forget, his. That subtle masculine scent, of iron and forest, which confused her more than any thought. Why, every time he came near, did her heart seem to remember something her mind wanted to deny? She despised him, of course. Or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. She hated him. Right? Caelan approached her side without announcing himself, leaving the hum of the conversations behind him. Eira straightened, as if his proximity made him more real, more dangerous.
"You don't seem to enjoy the feast," he said in a low voice, his gaze fixed on his cup.
Or does Easter inspire you more reflection than joy? Eira didn't take her eyes off the fire burning in the hearth. I've seen too many resurrections that didn't last more than a dawn, my lord. Sometimes what returns to life isn't the soul, but the memory of pain. Caelan nodded slowly, a shadow of a smile on his lips. Then you are more honest than many priests. I too know what it's like to wake up among ghosts. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable but dense, as if the words had opened a threshold neither dared cross.
"You saved those children," she said, breaking the stillness.
They believe in you. Perhaps that is already a form of resurrection. And you, he replied with dangerous calm, what do you believe in, sister? In God or in vengeance? The gazes met. Eira felt the air stop. There was no mockery in his tone, only a curiosity that hurt, a tenderness that shouldn't exist. I believe, she whispered, barely audible, in repentance. Though I don't know if mine will come in time. Caelan tilted his head, almost in a gesture of respect. Then you are not as lost as you think. And he stepped away, leaving her with trembling pulse, the sense that every word of his had touched a place that had been closed for far too long. Eira exhaled slowly. The murmur of the feast returned to fill the air.
But nothing tasted the same anymore.
Chapter 27. Stones on the path. Guilt wouldn't let her breathe. Eira knew she should have confessed her lies before Easter, when dawn still offered her a clean escape. But courage had not come, and now the day shone far too late. There was one way to redeem herself, however small. Speaking with Caelan was unthinkable, his mere presence stole her words. His mother, on the other hand, seemed more forgiving. And above all, she spoke her tongue. Lady Myreed, she murmured as everyone rose from the table, might I speak with you in private? The Countess smiled with that calm that commanded respect. Come with me, she said softly. To the solar. The room was bathed in warm golden light. The windows opened to the garden, where the air smelled of rosemary and damp earth. Eira lowered her head, afraid her voice might betray her nerves. I wish to ask your permission to teach the children from Caer Thalen, she said plainly. I have no right to anything but, perhaps I could be of some use. Myreed settled into a tall chair of red velvet, and regarded her with interest. And what do you propose to teach them? Letters, numbers, and perhaps songs, I replied timidly. The Countess gestured to the chair beside hers. Let us sit. Their adoptive parents may not see the use in that, but, her voice turned thoughtful, I believe every child should learn something beyond the weight of labor. Eira sat, grateful for her understanding tone. I thought to begin at dawn, she continued, before breaking the fast. Breakfast could be their reward. It would not interfere with their duties. Myreed nodded slowly, her gaze seeming to measure the soul before her. It is a noble idea. I'll speak with Sir Brannock, he'll know how to arrange it. Eira rose and bowed her head. Thank you, milady. The Countess stopped her with a gesture and touched her arm. Is there something else you wish to tell me? The air seemed to thicken. This was the moment, from which there would be no return. Eira felt her heart hammering in her chest. She could go on hiding or face the weight of her secret. Perhaps truth at last would set her free. I haven't been entirely honest, she confessed, her voice breaking. Her hands clutched the arms of the chair, as if the world might shift beneath her feet. Myreed did not look surprised. Her gaze was steady, compassionate. Speak, child. Believe me, silence hurts more than guilt. It's about my family. Eira whispered, avoiding her eyes. About who I truly am. Myreed watched her in silence. Then tell me, she said at last. Perhaps it is not as terrible as you believe. Eira opened her mouth, but the sound of footsteps cut her off. The door swung open without warning. Caelan entered. Sunlight shattered across his armor, and for a moment no one spoke. The air trembled, taut, as if the three of them shared a secret that had yet to be named. Maired's eyes shifted from her son to Eira. He frowned, puzzled, but something in their posture made him pause. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Caelan said quietly. His words sounded more intimate than he intended. Eira rose, her fingers cold. "I had finished, milady," she said in a faint voice. "Had you?" Mairead asked with a slight smile.
"It seemed to me you were just beginning."
Caelan looked at her, seeking an explanation she could not give. And in that instant, Eira understood that her secret had already begun to reveal itself, even though her lips had yet to speak it. Chapter 28. The Omen. "Mother," said Caelan, stopping short when he saw Eira in his parents' solar. He hadn't expected to find her there, bathed in the soft light of midday and the scent of dried flowers. "Forgive the interruption. A contingent of cavalry is approaching the bastion. Father asks that you join him in the tower." Lady Mairead rose at once, alert. "Is it Philip?"
"They're French," he replied, "but they don't bear the royal banner."
"Too few for an invading army." The Countess frowned thoughtfully. "Then perhaps envoys." Eira turned toward Caelan, pale.
"What should I do?"
He looked at her, startled by the fear that crossed her face. It wasn't a shallow fear, but one that sprang from something deeper than visible danger. "You have nothing to fear," he said calmly, trying to keep his voice steady. If the king had meant to send punishment, he wouldn't have done it with so few men. "We shall see," replied Mairead, adjusting her cloak with resolve. "I'll join your father." And with that she left the solar, leaving them alone. Caelan let out a quiet sigh of frustration. His mother had a curious habit of disappearing precisely when things turned uncomfortable, and she seemed to take pleasure in pushing him toward Eira, as if she saw in that woman an answer he had not sought. What Mairead didn't understand was that beyond her beauty, what kept him on guard was precisely this, the feeling that Eira was hiding something. He offered her his hand. Eira didn't move. Her eyes were fixed on some invisible point, lost in an inner struggle. "I'm afraid," she whispered. That confession disarmed him more than any challenge. For an instant he saw the woman beneath the habit, not the mask, the fragility, the courage, the loneliness. And without thinking, he took a step toward her. "They won't harm you," he promised, his voice low, almost a vow.
"Not while I still breathe."
Eira lifted her gaze. In her eyes there was something that was neither pure gratitude nor distrust, but a piercing mix of both.
"You can't promise that," she said softly.
"I can try," he replied, more gently. The silence between them filled with everything neither dared to say. The distance that separated them was minimal, yet it felt like an abyss. Eira drew a deep breath, searching for strength where none remained, and at last accepted his hand. Their fingers brushed, barely a touch, but so intense that both felt the tremor. They walked together toward the gallery, where the light streamed in golden shafts across the stone floor. Outside the sound of hooves drew near, slow and ominous. And though Eira walked at his side, Caelan had the clear impression that something unseen, a secret, a threat, was walking with them. Chapter 29. The enemy's return. The French cavalry crossed the gates of Morven, with the metallic thunder of armor. About 50 riders advanced in formation, dust clinging to their cloaks, banners barely visible through the haze. Aemon escorted them stiffly, leading the Norman detachment that had received them with caution. From the threshold of the tower, Caelan, Finn and Eira watched the scene from the shadows, standing behind the Count and Countess. The air smelled of iron and distrust. Eira felt the tension in Caelan's arm, where her hand clung almost without realizing it. She understood why when the French captain removed his helmet. "Count Lucien de Ravine," murmured Caelan with disdain. The name was like a dagger. Eira felt the blood drain from her face. The world tilted, and if Caelan hadn't caught her by the waist, she would have collapsed. Courage, he whispered by her ear. He won't recognize you. She barely managed to reply, how can you be so sure? Caelan looked down at her, and for an instant the edge of his voice softened into tenderness. Because the man who once met an old, exhausted nun could never see in you a young, beautiful woman. Eira stared at him, stunned. The air turned to fire in her lungs. He wasn't smiling with mockery, but with a warmth she hadn't expected, a simple truth that disarmed her. And for a moment, just one, the fear receded. Caelan of Morven thought her beautiful. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and faced the courtyard with dignity. De Rovine dismounted slowly, his hard calculating gaze sweeping over those present. He greeted them with a minimal bow. Viscount of Morven, he said with feigned courtesy, I bring news from Paris. Caelan inclined his head, showing no trace of friendliness. And I bring memory, he replied gravely. You won't forget it. Ravine's glacial smile barely shifted. King Philip holds you in higher regard than you deserve.
Then I must fear for his judgment, Caelan answered.
The exchange, steeped in poisoned politeness, drew a brief silence. Mairead intervened, with the grace of one who ruled over diplomatic abysses. My Lord Count, she said, you are welcome in Morven. We trust your journey has been peaceful. It has, Ravine replied. Though not every road in France could say the same. His eyes passed over the group, and lingered on Eira. She felt a chill ripple across her skin. Caelan stepped forward, subtly placing himself between them. My mother will show you the hospitality of this house, he said. I'll see to your men. Ravine held his gaze, and in that look passed something only Caelan could read, a silent challenge, a reminder of the past they shared. Then he turned slowly, and allowed the servants to lead him inside. Only when the sound of spurs faded, did Eira release the breath she had been holding. I didn't know fear could have a face, she murmured. Caelan looked at her gravely. That man wears one. But he won't see yours again. She lifted her eyes to him, grateful and bewildered. Why do you protect me, Caelan? I'm not your responsibility. He hesitated for a moment before answering. Perhaps because sometimes one doesn't choose whom to save, just as one doesn't choose who will condemn them. He left her there by the gate, his words hanging between them like the echo of a confession. Eira watched his figure disappear, wondering whether what she felt was relief, or a new kind of danger. Chapter 30. Subterfuge. Caelan remained in the shadows, watching. He knew he would have to speak with de Rovine sooner or later, but he would do it on his own terms, not on that man's. The Frenchman advanced with the studied elegance of a courtier, and executed a shallow bow. My Lord Count of Morven, I presume, he said in an oily voice. Lucien de Rovine, Count of Belvin. I bring greetings from His Majesty Philip Augustus, King of France. Caelan's father, upright and serene, replied with that calm irony that could disarm any diplomat. We are honored, though disappointed that His Majesty could not enjoy the pleasure of coming in person. Caelan stifled a smile. Ravine hesitated for barely an instant, before recovering his composure. After his visit to Rouen, he said in a pretentious tone, the king plans to tour all the noble houses of Normandy. However, he sends me ahead, to address an urgent matter with your son. It concerns a fugitive. Beside him, Eira tensed. Caelan noticed it even before she drew a sharp breath, as if the word had pierced her. Fearing she might move or give herself away, he placed a steady, reassuring hand on her arm. Do not let fear carry you, he murmured, barely audible. His father intervened without losing composure. I cannot imagine what connection my son might have to such matters, he said, but you and your men are welcome to enjoy the hospitality of this house. Ravine arched a brow, his smile tinged with cynicism. I hope that hospitality includes the famous Morven apple brandy. They say even the saints envy it. You shall taste it, replied the Count with frozen courtesy. As his parents turned to lead the visitor inside, Caelan slipped an arm around Eira's waist, guiding her discreetly a step back out of reach. The gesture was merely protective, but in her it sparked something more than gratitude. De Ravine of course missed nothing. He paused, turning toward them with feigned innocence. "The Viscount will accompany us of course," he said with a smile dripping with venom. "And his charming wife." Eira held her breath. Caelan felt her body tense beneath his hand. "Naturally," he replied, his voice dry. The Frenchman held his gaze a moment longer before following their hosts. Caelan did not move, until the sound of the French boots faded down the corridor. Only then did he slowly lower his arm, though he could still feel her trembling through his skin. "Your beauty is a dangerous weapon," he said, his irony masking fury. "If that man looks at you like that again, I'll forget the diplomacy my mother so admires." Eira lowered her eyes. "I am not your wife, my lord," she whispered. "No," he replied, a faint smile crossing his lips. "But at this moment, your life depends on seeming so." The silence that followed was heavy with all that neither dared to say. She looked at him, and for an instant fear mingled with something else, something that hurt and drew her in at once. Caelan turned his gaze toward the hallway where de Ravine's shadow waited. "We'll play his game," he said. "But by our rules." And as he led her toward the hall, Eira realized she no longer knew which of them was pretending more, he in protecting her, or she in letting him. The farce. Eira could barely breathe. Fear held her captive, as if each breath depended on the arm that supported her. Caelan's presence was her only anchor, his strength, his warmth, the steady rhythm of his breathing. If he stepped away, she felt she would dissolve into the floor like spilled water. Ravine had mistaken her for the Viscount's wife. The wife of Caelan of Morven. Her heart pounded fiercely. How much must it wound a man like him, to accept such a deception? And yet she knew the lie would not hold for long. Sooner or later, someone would speak. And he owed her nothing. She had to free him from the charade. She began, trying to explain. But Caelan lifted a finger, and pressed it gently to her lips. A firm, silent gesture. "Not now," he whispered. The touch was so light it barely existed, but the faint scent of brandy lingering on his skin sent a shiver through her. Eira closed her eyes for an instant, fighting the urge to follow that trace, to forget the danger and surrender to the feeling. "You shouldn't," she tried to say, her voice barely a thread. "The die is cast," he replied, his voice deep, caught between anger and resolve. "Ravine will leave here believing you are my wife. And until he does, we will both play that part." She swallowed hard, searching for air that wasn't there. "And if someone discovers the truth?" Caelan looked at her, solemn. "Then I'll bear the blame. But until that moment, you must stand firm. No one can smell fear." Eira nodded slowly, though her trembling voice betrayed her. "It won't be hard to pretend that I care for you, my lord," she murmured. "What will be hard is pretending I care only for the sake of pretending." The silence that followed was thick, pulsing. Caelan watched her, trying to discern whether she spoke in earnest or if fear had made her ramble. But what he saw in her eyes was not confusion, it was a candor that disarmed him. His reply was barely a breath. "Don't play with fire, Eira." "Too late," she whispered with a trembling half-smile. "I think it's already caught us both." Caelan looked away, as if afraid of what his own gaze might betray. He knew that this charade, noble though its purpose might be, would not be easy to sustain. Because every word, every gesture, every shared lie carried weight, and his was beginning to feel dangerously real. Chapter 31. The Deception. Caelan slipped an arm around Eira's waist, holding her firmly as he guided her toward the solarium. His hand found hers, and he felt the tremor. If he let go, she would collapse. And yet, something in that touch unsettled him more than the fear they were trying to conceal. He didn't know which emotion to surrender to. The idea of being married to Eira bordered on the absurd, yet nothing about their situation was amusing. De Ravine's mention of a fugitive troubled him. Why would the King of France care about a woman's escape? Unless, he thought, a knot tightening in his stomach, she wasn't just any fugitive. He glanced at her from the corner of his eye. Eira walked beside him, pale and silent but with her head held high. There was something in her that didn't fit the humility she claimed to have, an innate dignity, an air that could not be feigned. Caelan had always known she was hiding something. And now he felt the truth closing in on them. Even so, he couldn't hate her. For some perverse reason, he liked having her this close. Feeling the warmth of her body against his, the fragility that clung to his strength. It was a living reminder that not everything in him was made of stone. He couldn't deny her beauty, eyes like a forest before a storm, a voice that soothed, the courage with which she had protected the children. He remembered the night the wolves had surrounded them, the way Eira had stepped forward without hesitation, the silent ferocity in her stance. Few women, he thought, would have shown such courage. A fleeting thought pierced him like a blade: the man who marries her will be a lucky one. The irony of it made him smile faintly. For a second, he allowed himself to imagine it. And that second was enough to realize that pretending would not be as easy as he had promised. Eira looked up at him, startled by the prolonged silence. "What are you thinking?" she asked in a trembling voice. Caelan took a moment before replying. "How fragile a lie can be," he said at last, "and how strange it feels to wish it would last a little longer." Eira looked at him, not fully understanding, though her chest tightened. He turned his gaze toward the solarium door, where the dangerous game they had begun awaited them. "Come, my wife," he murmured with soft irony, offering his arm. "The part demands conviction." She accepted, though she knew that if she kept looking at him like that, not even the lie would save her. The hallway of destiny. They moved down the corridor, the sound of Ravine's footsteps setting the rhythm of her fear. Eira followed him with her gaze fixed on the back of his neck, as if watching him could somehow change the fate pulling her forward. With each step the servants moved aside, bowing to the French count and his entourage. Caelan kept his arm firmly around her waist, and more than one curious or scandalized look rose in their wake. Eira noticed, but she didn't care. That arm was the only thing keeping her upright. Without it she would have fallen or fled, and there was no refuge left in the world that could save her. The air of the castle felt heavier, more hostile than ever, as if the very walls were listening to her lie. And yet a pang of sorrow pierced her. This might be the last time she walked those halls, the same halls where she had first begun to feel safe, where Caelan's voice had carried with the authority of a man bound to the land and to loyalty. If only Morven could be my home, she thought. If only he could be. She didn't finish the thought. It was too painful, too impossible. If they had truly been husband and wife, Caelan would have protected her with his soul, the same way he defended his people, his honor, his name. But that was not their story. "You should breathe," he murmured without looking at her. "If you stay this tense, they'll think I'm dragging you as my prisoner." She let out a faint, nervous laugh. "Perhaps that's what I am." Caelan turned toward her, and for an instant the light in his eyes was enough to undo her. "No." His voice was a low murmur, almost a caress. "Prisoners don't walk beside me. I only walk with those I wish to protect." Eira lowered her gaze, unable to hold his. Her heart ached as if those words were true. "And if you don't wish to protect me, my lord?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Caelan smiled without humor. "Too late. I already have." The silence that followed was thick, heavy with something neither dared to name. The echo of their footsteps mingled with the distant murmur of the French settling in the hall. Eira thought that if destiny ever had a voice it would sound like Caelan's, and take the shape of his hand on her waist, steady, unforgettable. But the truth remained, relentless, like a wound beneath the skin. He did not love her. Perhaps he didn't even like her. And yet, she had never felt more completely his. Chapter 32. He knows. The oak bench in the solarium was far from comfortable, but it allowed Eira to remain beside Caelan. His hand, strong and roughened by the sword, intertwined with hers, lending her a steadiness her courage alone could not summon. That touch was her only defense against the trembling that coursed through her. The Count and Countess spoke with measured courtesy, while the king's envoy sipped the apple brandy with an air of superiority. The sweet, sharp scent of the liquor hung in the air, and Eira breathed it in to steady herself. The warmth that slid down her throat was almost a comfort, a brief truce before the storm. Ravine raised his glass and smiled. "Your brandy lives up to its reputation," he said. "But alas, it is time we spoke of more serious matters." The sound of his voice stirred the sleeping serpent in Eira's belly. Her fingers tensed, and Caelan, without taking his eyes off the Frenchman, tightened his grip on hers. "After the fall of Caer Thalen," Ravine continued, with feigned indifference, "a certain little nun told me of a relative of King John's who sought refuge among the survivors." The silence that followed was absolute. Eira felt the cold creep up her arms. She knew what that meant. The prisoners must have been questioned, perhaps tortured to extract names. Her secret had finally caught up with her. Caelan's grip grew more intense, almost painful. "He knows." Lady Myrede spoke in a gentle tone, though her eyes gleamed with steel. "And no doubt, monsieur, you sent that lady to your king at once." The sarcasm was barely veiled by courtesy. Ravine inclined his head. "If I had found her, But even the most thorough searches failed to uncover her." Count Alaric spoke calmly.
"Then we must assume she is dead."
Eira's heart lurched. Caelan did not release her hand. He held it so tightly that she understood, the Morvens knew. And still, they protected her. Ravine nodded slowly. "That is what I thought. Until the same nun told me something curious. She claimed that an English lady escaped the castle disguised as a religious." He smiled, cold and precise.
"The novice was most distressed at having been abandoned."
Eira felt the blood drain from her face. She could imagine the girl's terror, betrayed by panic and the will to survive. She did not blame her. Ravine set his glass down with a sharp click and fixed his gaze on Caelan. "Then perhaps, my esteemed Viscount, you can tell me what became of the nun who accompanied you in your flight from Caer Thalen?" The air seemed to thicken. Caelan met his gaze without blinking, and when he spoke his voice carried the dangerous calm of a sheathed blade. "She died on the road," he said simply. Ravine tilted his head like a curious cat. "Indeed?" "Of cold," Caelan added, his eyes never wavering. "And of fear. Her body lay in the snow, but her soul, if it was innocent, found a better place." The silence that followed was glacial. Eira didn't breathe. She knew Caelan had just sealed his fate with a lie that could cost him his life. Ravine smiled slowly.
"What a pious tale."
Caelan inclined his head slightly. "Miracles don't always smell of incense, monsieur. Sometimes they smell of blood." The Frenchman's eyes narrowed, searching for cracks. But he found none. And in that moment, Eira understood that Caelan was not merely protecting her. He was claiming her. The game of lies. Caelan measured his breath before replying. Every word could become a blade, and Ravine was far too cunning to let any slip go unnoticed. But his father, with the composure of a man who had mastered both men and silences, spoke first. "I would have suggested you search for her in Carne," said the Count. "She intended to spend her final days there, among the ladies of the convent. I doubt she is the woman you seek." Ravine raised his eyebrows.
"Her final days?"
Lady Myrede interjected without hesitation, her tone as soft as the edge of a dagger. "Hunger took its toll. Her body no longer accepted food. When we found her, she was already resigned to fade away. I suppose you yourself had written her off as lost, monsieur, when you last saw her." Caelan suppressed a smile. His mother had a gift for turning truth into elegant poison, and she had just reminded the Frenchman of his own negligence. Ravine frowned, unsettled. "Would have suggested," he repeated, catching the trap in the verb tense. Count Alaric held his gaze, unhurried. "Sadly, the poor woman died on the road to Carne," he said, lifting his glass. "Our men buried her with the proper rites. And why not deliver the body to the sisters of the convent?" Ravine pressed, sharpening his tone. The Count took a slow sip of brandy, smiling still. "It was my order that they return at once. You know well how things stand in Normandy. No castle can afford to lose men, even for mercy's sake. The silence that followed stretched long and tense. Ravine regarded him with a mix of irritation and calculation, perfectly aware of the veiled threat. Caelan felt an almost childish urge to applaud. His father hadn't just closed the trap with elegance, he had reminded the envoy that Morven was not an easy stronghold to breach by force or by intrigue. The Frenchman leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his frustration. His eyes, however, returned once more to Eira, who remained silent, her hand still entwined with Caelan's. He felt the faint tremor of her fingers and tightened his hold, a warning and a promise all at once. "Don't speak. Don't fear." Ravine's voice softened, though his gaze was that of a predator. "Curious, there are always stories that resurface when least expected." Caelan inclined his head slightly. "And almost always they die with the dawn." The exchange ended there. But as silence filled the room once more, Eira understood that the true battle was not fought on the field, it was waged between words. And Caelan of Morven, with his relentless calm, had just saved her again. Chapter 33. The Perfect Lie. When Ravine turned his gaze on them, sharp as a blade, Eira held her breath. She prayed, if she still remembered how, that he wouldn't recognize her as the false nun who had fled Caer Thalen. Though deep down she knew he couldn't have recognized her, that frightened woman had died among snow and hunger. The one who now sat beside Caelan was someone else. Sensing her tension, he wrapped an arm around her shoulders in a gesture as protective as it was calculated. The closeness was feigned, but the warmth was not. If only it were true, she thought, before fear smothered the hope. Ravine stroked his beard and with a smile laced with venom addressed Caelan. "And are you certain, Viscount, that the nun who travelled with you was not an impostor?" Caelan crossed one leg over the other with apparent indifference. Eira watched him, admiring the serenity with which he lied. She would have given anything to seem that unshaken. "My only concern," said Caelan calmly, "was bringing my men and the orphans back alive. The nun cared for the children. I barely spoke with her." Ravine tilted his head. "Ah oui, the children you brought to your castle without permission." Eira felt Caelan's arm tense around her, though his voice remained steady. "I imagined a French count wouldn't lose sleep over the fate of a few Norman orphans." The Frenchman gave a short laugh. "You're right. But now they're French," he replied with mockery. "I would be delighted to meet them, and offer His Majesty's regards." Eira felt the dizzy edge of danger. She could sense in Caelan the effort, the restraint it took not to reveal the fury burning beneath his skin. His fingers, resting against her neck, began to move slowly in what seemed a casual gesture. But when the touch became a faint massage, Eira understood what he was doing. It wasn't desire, it was control. He was keeping her from fainting. Even so, her body betrayed her. Fear turned into a burning heat, an absurd need to cling to him, to believe in the lie that bound them. The spell broke when Lady Myrede rose with the elegance of someone who could save everyone without raising her voice. "Perhaps it would be best for you to meet the children tomorrow, monsieur," she said sweetly, though her eyes did not smile. "No doubt they are busy with their duties now. Our steward will show you to your chambers. And of course, you are welcome at our table tonight." Ravine bowed courteously. "I thank you for your hospitality, Countess. And I must apologize for not having introduced myself sooner to the Viscount's wife." His eyes lingered on Eira. Curiously, the fugitive lady also had red hair. Eira felt the blood freeze in her veins. She clenched her jaw, trying to answer, but no sound came from her throat. Count Alaric intervened with a calm smile. "My apologies, monsieur," he said. "Eira is a relative of my wife, and my eldest son's betrothed." Ravine blinked, surprised. Then he smiled, that kind of smile that hides poison. "Ah, then my congratulations." The silence that followed was brief, but it left behind an invisible tension, as if everyone had felt the brush of a blade. When the Frenchman left the hall, Eira finally released the breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Caelan didn't look at her, but his arm remained around her, steady, almost possessive. You've just turned my lie into a shield, she whispered. He answered without taking his eyes from the door. No. Into a promise. And Eira, without quite understanding why, felt that promise hurt more than any truth ever could. Chapter 34. An oath on the edge of silence and fire. Steward Sir Brannock appeared as if summoned by instinct, punctual, silent, with that efficient composure that always marked him. Ravine bowed, exchanged a few brief words and followed him out of the hall. The moment the door closed, Eira collapsed against the back of the bench, drained of relief. Caelan, however, did not remove his arm from around her shoulders. Perhaps because he still felt the tension in her, or perhaps because he didn't want to stop feeling it. He had only meant to calm her. But the brush of his fingers at her nape, the heat of her body against his, had awakened something that was anything but fraternal. And he knew it. By the trembling in her, by the way she held her breath, he knew he wasn't the only one who felt it. Still, neither of them moved. The silence between them was as fragile as the lie that protected them. Perhaps his father's announcement, that false promise of marriage, had unsettled her more than she let on. Caelan took no pleasure in playing that part, but he understood it was the lesser evil. Better that than to see her marched away in chains, or dead, by the order of a king they both despised. He knew, with growing certainty, that his family had discovered the truth. That his mother, his father, even Aemon suspected it. And yet they had cloaked her in the same silence they used to guard what they loved. Before he could gather his thoughts, Lady Mairead approached. Eira rose at once, and Caelan, almost without thinking, followed. The emptiness her absence left beside him felt more real than any word. "Milady," murmured Eira, lowering her gaze. Mairead took her hands gently.
You tried to tell me, didn't you?
Caelan frowned.
What are you talking about?
Eira looked at him then, and the sincerity in her eyes was disarming. I was going to confess who I am before the French arrive. He met her gaze, feeling the sting of wounded pride, a mix of jealousy and disappointment he couldn't quite justify. If anyone had the right to know the truth, it was him.
Why didn't you tell me? He asked, his voice low and taut.
She looked away. Because I feared you would hand me over to them. Caelan clenched his jaw. After all this, you still believe I'd sell you to the enemy? Eira looked back at him, her sadness born not of guilt but of exhaustion. I feared everyone, Caelan. Until you saved me. Caelan's father stepped forward then, breaking the invisible thread between them. She knows now, son, he said calmly. But be fair. How could she have known she could trust you? Or any of us, for that matter? Eira drew a deep breath, and spoke with a serenity that belied the tremor in her hands.
None of that matters anymore.
Ravine suspects who I am. And I regret bringing his danger to your door. It would be better for everyone if I left. Caelan took a step toward her without realizing it. And where would you go? He asked, his tone edged with restrained fury. Anywhere my name isn't a death sentence, she replied bitterly. No. His voice dropped lower, more intimate.
You're not going anywhere.
Eira looked at him, startled by his tone.
You can't decide that.
I already have, he said. And for once I don't care if it's a mistake. Mairead exchanged a glance with her husband, who nodded silently. They both understood that nothing they said could stop what was already unfolding between the two. Caelan took a slow breath, struggling for control, and added softly, You won't run again.
Not while I'm here.
Eira looked at him for a long time, until her resistance finally broke, not from fear, but from the terrible tender certainty that she no longer knew how to live without him. Chapter 35. Fire beneath the snow. Locked away in Caer Thalen, Eira had come to know true fear. There she had learned that danger did not always roar, it could wait silent, wearing a human face. She thought she had escaped when she fled that fortress, but soon understood that freedom was merely another kind of flight. Safety lay in England, or so she told herself. Yet with each passing day, she drifted farther from home and closer to a man she should never have wanted. Caelan of Morven, a knight of honor, an enemy by blood, had become her only certainty. And that perhaps was the most dangerous truth of all. "I must return to England," she said at last, her voice breaking into a whisper. She trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what she had just spoken. Caelan did not answer right away. He simply reached out and took her hands gently, as though afraid they might shatter. "Look at me," he said. She hesitated, fearing to find judgment, censure, even disdain in his eyes. But when she obeyed, what she found instead was compassion, so deep it unstrung her soul. "England is not an option," he said quietly. "Not now." The trembling in her body began to fade, dissolved by the steadiness of his touch. Eira nodded, unable to form words. "And in any case," Caelan added with a faint note of weary irony, "escape is impossible while Ravine still breathes Morven's air." "I know," she whispered, closing her eyes. He opened his just enough to find hers. "Then we have only one choice. Convince that damned count that you are the most devoted fiancée a man could wish for. And that I am, hopelessly in love with you." Eira drew in a sharp breath, as though the words had pierced her defenses. "Are you?" she asked, her voice so faint it barely belonged to her. Caelan looked at her with dangerous calm. "If I were," he said slowly, "would it comfort you or frighten you more?" She lowered her gaze, her heart in disarray. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I fear the lie will become truth." He smiled faintly, without joy. "It already has, Eira. The only question is which of us will admit it first." The silence that followed hung between them like a suspended spell. She looked at him, unable to hold back her tears, and he made no move to retreat. He simply remained there, holding her with his hands, his gaze, that quiet strength that asked for nothing yet said everything. Eira closed her eyes. She knew he was right, to keep pretending would only make her fall deeper. But she no longer knew if she wanted to be saved. "It won't be that bad." Caelan drew her close almost without thinking, telling himself he did it only because he hated seeing a woman cry. Eira had endured too much. He could not blame her for doing what she had to in order to survive, nor for the blood that ran in her veins, nor even for her kinship with a king he despised. It should have felt uncomfortable to play the part of her betrothed, but it didn't. Not when he felt her trembling against his chest, fragile and alive all at once. Eira's slender body fit against his with unsettling ease, as if fate or the lie had woven them from the same thread. It had been so long since he had held a woman like this. The memory of what he had lost cut through him like a shadow, and to drive it away he closed his eyes. He rested his chin atop her head, and breathed in the scent of lavender that clung to her hair. "It won't be so bad," he murmured, more to himself than to her. Eira did not answer. She simply let herself be held, breathing slowly, as if that embrace offered the truth she hadn't known in years. Caelan felt her breathing fall into rhythm with his, and something within him gave way quietly without resistance. The warmth of her body was not merely pleasant, it felt necessary. As though her presence, her fragility, her trembling faith in him, were the first truly human thing he had touched in far too long. His fingers brushed the fabric of her gown, the gentle curve of her back. It wasn't desire that moved him, or not only that, but a quiet certainty. This woman, by chance or by providence, belonged to his life in a way he could not yet understand. Eira lifted her gaze, her eyes wet but unafraid. "Why are you so kind to me, Caelan?" she whispered. He smiled faintly, a gesture without irony or defense. "Perhaps because I need to believe I still can be, with someone." She looked at him for a long time, as if trying to imprint the moment in her memory. And in the silence that surrounded them, the rhythm of their hearts was the only truth no one could deny. The quiver of the moment. Little by little, Eira's agitation began to fade, like a wave losing strength upon the shore. Being in Caelan's arms was against all reason, a refuge. The steady beat beneath her cheek, the warmth of his body, the scent of iron and wood, all spoke of a world to which she had never belonged, yet for a moment believed she might. She let herself drift into that calm rhythm, into the breathing that intertwined with her own. It was as if time had stopped, as if nothing existed beyond that small space between their bodies, where nothing hurt and nothing was feared. She closed her eyes. For a second she allowed herself to imagine the impossible, a future without masks, without flight, without lies. A future where that man did not pretend to protect her, but chose her. Then a polite cough broke the spell. Eira lifted her head, startled, and her eyes met Caelan's. The blue in his gaze had darkened, dense and uncertain in its own confusion. For an instant, what they saw in each other was not compassion or courtesy, but recognition. Neither spoke. There was no need. Caelan exhaled slowly, as if his own body betrayed him, and carefully withdrew his hands from her. The gesture was harder than he would have liked to admit. "It seems," he murmured with a strained half-smile, "we have an audience." Eira turned, her cheeks flushed. Lady Mairead stood in the doorway, watching with the calm only a mother who has seen everything can afford.
"I hope I'm not interrupting," said the Countess softly.
"Dinner is ready." "Perfect," Caelan replied, stepping a little farther from Eira, though breathing still felt difficult. "It will be a pleasure to go on pretending in public." Eira glanced sideways at him, still blushing but with a spark of irony. "You're a better actor than I thought." "And you," he returned without looking at her, "are far more dangerous than I imagined." Their eyes met one last time before leaving the solar. Nothing in their gestures betrayed what had just happened. But both knew that something had changed, something impossible to pretend. Chapter 36. Hard to see the good. Caelan and his father stepped aside to speak with Sir Brannock, the steward. They had to ensure that the orphans and their new guardians kept silent, that no one mentioned the truth about the nun, who had escaped from Caer Thalen. The Earl would see to distracting Ravine with diplomacy, or with veiled threats if needed. Eira, meanwhile, was left alone with Lady Mairead. She didn't know what to do with her hands. She clasped them, released them, then clasped them again. "I've brought danger to your home," she said at last, her voice low and trembling. "I'm sorry I didn't confess it sooner." The Countess regarded her with gentle affection. "Dear child," she replied, "we all carry the shadows of our kin. My own brother, if you recall, was one of the men who murdered an archbishop. One cannot choose one's blood, but one can choose what to do with it." Eira looked up, surprised by the serenity in her tone. "We cannot break the ties of blood," Lady Mairead went on, "but neither are we prisoners to them. The sins of our kin do not define us, even if they haunt us like ghosts." "And yet," Eira whispered, "if Ravine discovers who I am, I'll endanger all of you." The Countess shook her head softly. "My dear, danger is already woven into these times. Even without you here there would be storms. Sometimes fate does not change its path, it merely changes its face." Eira lowered her gaze, her hands clenched in her lap. "You say I should look for the good that might come of all this. But I confess I struggle to see it." A warm, almost mischievous smile lit the Countess's face. "Then look for it where it always hides, in the unexpected. A woman betrothed to a young and handsome knight should radiate joy, not remorse. Ravine will never believe your betrothal, if you go on looking like a prisoner." Eira drew a deep breath. There was irony in the lady's words, but wisdom too. She inhaled once more, and with a boldness she scarcely recognized in herself said, "It won't be hard to pretend I'm in love with your son, milady." Lady Mairead raised an eyebrow. "As I thought," she replied, a faint smile curving her lips. Eira felt the heat rise to her cheeks. The Countess took her hand and added more softly, "Let me give you a piece of advice, dear. Pretending to love someone is the most dangerous way to discover it." The words struck her like a bell. Eira lowered her gaze, unable to respond, because deep down she already knew it was too late. Chapter 37. The weight of a promise. The orphans and their new families had gathered in a corner of the great hall, summoned by Sir Brannock. Caelan joined them, hoping his presence would lend weight to the message he had to deliver. When he entered, the conversations died down. Eowyn, The little girl with dark braids ran up to him and tugged at his cloak. "Can I ride on your shoulders?" she asked, with the impatience of someone who still believed the world was safe. Caelan smiled gently. "In a moment, little one," he said, lifting her up to rest against his side. "First, I need everyone to listen carefully to what I'm about to say." The adults nodded solemnly. The children, however, looked at him with wide, curious eyes. Caelan hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to frighten them, but he couldn't lie to them either. "We have guests," he began slowly. A murmur swept through the room.
"Frenchman," one of the men spat, his tone thick with restrained bitterness.
Caelan didn't correct him. There was no need. The children understood more than they said. "Their commander will dine here today," he went on. "Some of you will remember him, from Caer Thalen." A heavy silence fell over the group. Eowyn shivered in his arms. "We remember," she whispered. Caelan brushed a hand through her hair. "I know, little one." He drew a deep breath before continuing. "That man is looking for Lady Eira. He believes she escaped disguised as a nun, and he wants to take her back there.
But we've deceived him.
He thinks the woman who traveled with us died on the road to Carne." The murmurs turned into a low hum of fear. Eowyn looked up at him, her eyes wide with worry. "But Sister Eira wasn't a nun. If he finds out, he'll take her back." Caelan clenched his jaw. "I won't let anyone take her anywhere," he said, his voice steady, resonating against the stone walls and in their hearts.
"Not her, not any of you."
"I swear it by my name and by my sword." He paused, choosing his words carefully. He knew what he was asking was too much, but there was no other choice. "If necessary," he continued, "Lady Eira will become my wife. That way she'll be under my protection.
But to keep up that appearance,
I'll need your help." A reverent silence followed his words. Then one by one, the adults nodded. The children instead rushed toward him, wrapping their small arms around him, whispering promises of secrecy and loyalty. Caelan smiled, deeply moved. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that good was still possible. Finally, he lifted Eowyn onto his shoulders. She gripped his hair with nervous laughter, then suddenly asked in a serious voice, "Does Lady Eira still have her dagger?" Caelan stopped, surprised. "Why do you ask?" The girl looked down at him from above, a mix of innocence and precocious wisdom in her gaze. "Because sometimes promises need more than words to be kept." Caelan looked up at her, and felt a chill run down his spine. Never had such small words carried so much weight. Chapter 38. The Edge of Destiny. Alone in her chamber, Eira knelt beside the bed. The silence of the castle wrapped around her like a shroud. She slipped her hand beneath the mattress, and drew out the small dagger wrapped in linen. The metal, cold as dawn, gleamed beneath the trembling light of the candle. She unsheathed it carefully. The blade still held the sharp gleam of weapons forged by her grandfather. She pressed her fingertip to the point. A drop of blood bloomed, red and perfect.
"Sharp," she murmured in a voice that didn't sound like her own.
One quick, sure strike and it would all end, the fear, the lies, the burden she had laid upon those who had taken her in. Caelan would be free of his promise. She of her guilt. She ran her thumb over the wound, and felt the pulse of her own heart throbbing within that tiny cut. The thought of death didn't terrify her as much as the thought of dishonor.
But did she have the courage to see it through?
Could she drive the steel into her chest and close her eyes? A soft sound made her turn. The door had opened slightly. Caelan stood there. He said nothing. His eyes rested on the bloodied blade, then on the drop still trembling on her finger. He stepped inside slowly, as if afraid that a single movement might make her vanish. "No," he said quietly, his voice low and steady.
"Not like this."
Eira tightened her grip on the dagger. "You don't know what it means to live with a sentence hanging over your head." Caelan took a step forward. "And you don't know what it means to live after letting hope die." The silence between them was an abyss. She lowered her gaze. I can't drag you down with me, she whispered. I've already hurt you enough. Caelan shook his head.
What would hurt me is losing you.
His voice was barely a breath, yet the tremor in it carried more weight than an oath. He came closer and, without snatching the weapon away, held out his hand. Trust me. That's all I ask. Eira looked at him, her eyes wet, her heart torn between longing and fear. For one endless second the blade seemed to hover between them. Then, without breaking his gaze, she placed the dagger in his hand. Caelan closed his fingers around the weapon, and with the other hand brushed her cheek. Strength doesn't always lie in wielding a sword, he said.
Sometimes it's in knowing when to let it go.
She trembled, relieved and lost all at once. When he stepped back, the silence returned, but it was no longer the same. It was the silence of something that had just begun. Chapter 39. First Act. A man of honor was expected to escort his betrothed to the banquet. Caelan drew a deep breath before knocking on Eira's chamber door. He didn't know why the gesture quickened his pulse. When Leora the maid opened it with a smile and a curtsy, he felt a wave of relief. He hadn't wanted to find her alone. My lord, Leora announced with a knowing glint in her eyes, Lady Eira is ready. The door opened fully, and Caelan lost his breath. He recognized the gown at once, one of his sister's old dresses. But on Eira, it was not the same gown. The emerald green fabric seemed to set her skin aglow, and the firelight played along the pearls woven through her copper hair. The neckline hinted just enough to throw his breathing off rhythm. For a moment, he forgot why he had come. She mistook his silence for disapproval. Is it too much? She asked softly, as if bracing for rebuke. Caelan slowly shook his head, still caught by the sight.
No, he murmured.
You are radiant. He almost added like a countess, but stopped himself. It wasn't the time to blur truth and pretense.
This was supposed to be only an act.
Eira smiled shyly. And you truly look the part of a knight in a tale. Caelan allowed himself a brief smile. He had chosen his best tunic, red as wine, and freshly polished boots. He rarely cared about his appearance, but the fact that she noticed felt absurdly like a victory.
Shall we? He asked, offering his arm.
She laid her hand on it lightly, though he could feel her warmth through the fabric. They walked together down the corridor, beneath the torchlight. As they went, the murmur of voices and the scent of roasted meat drifted from the great hall. Caelan thought with a strange pang that they made a convincing pair. Elegant. Natural. Almost real. Ravine will believe what he sees, he murmured, leaning closer. Eira glanced at him sideways, a trace of irony in her smile.
Then do not try too hard, my lord.
I wouldn't want you to end up convinced as well. Caelan paused for a heartbeat, caught off guard by the quiet boldness in her tone. Then he replied softly, too late. She looked at him, unsure if she had heard him right. But he had already turned his gaze away, offering his arm once more. They continued toward the hall, where everyone awaited the start of their charade. And yet, for both of them, something in that lie had begun to feel dangerously real.